He was just a kid in muddy boots, standing outside a factory no one thought he belonged in. No college degree. No name badge. No respect. And yet, when the $6 million machine broke down after elite engineers failed for 2 weeks straight, they laughed when he stepped forward. "He's just the janitor's nephew," someone scoffed. But what happened next? Because this boy didn't just fix the impossible. He exposed every lie this company told itself about power, race, and who gets to lead. You're about to witness a moment that flipped a corporation upside down. Where one act of quiet brilliance broke a generation of prejudice. But before we begin, if stories of justice, courage, and real transformation inspire you, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Because what you're about to see isn't fiction. It's a true story. And it will change how you see everything. He stood against the industrial wall beside the janitor's supply closet, his once solid work boots caked in Mississippi mud, the shoulders of his faded checkered shirt worn thin by years of use. In that moment, silence blanketed the control room at Creston Dynamics, the largest robotics manufacturing plant in Little Rock, Arkansas, just before the ridicule began. The new CEO, Graham Whitaker, leaned forward and pointed coldly at the teenager standing quietly near the hallway door. "You really think you can fix this $6 million machine?" he sneered, loud enough for the entire control team to hear. The room erupted in laughter. The engineers, the managers, even the plant supervisors, all of them laughed. Not just because the question sounded absurd, but because the target of that sarcasm wasn't one of them. To them, he was just the black farmer's kid from outside Jackson County. An outsider. A shadow trailing his janitor uncle on the night shift. Someone who didn't even belong inside the control room, much less near the multimillion-dollar automated packaging line that had been broken down for 2 straight weeks. But the boy Jalen Carter didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. There was something still and deliberate in his silence, something that made a few of the younger engineers quiet down for a moment, just a second. Then it passed. Someone muttered under their breath, "Yeah, right," and the laughter swelled again. At just 13 years old, Jalen stood with his back against the cold cinderblock wall, watching it all. His eyes, calm but unreadable, moved slowly across the room, taking in the twisted smiles, the mocking stares, the prideful smirks of men who believed their degrees and salaries made them untouchable. None of them knew who Jalen really was. None of them could have guessed the weight of the truth he carried, a truth that would not only upend the fate of that factory floor, but would echo through the entire company's future like a thunderclap. The air inside Creston Dynamics was heavy that day. Not just with the thick scent of oil and scorched wiring, but with unspoken tension. Like even the steel walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, the Arkansas sun beat down on acres of loading docks and freight trucks, but inside, under the flicker of humming fluorescent lights, hope had grown colder than winter. The laughter that rang out at Jalen's expense wasn't just cruelty. It was survival. It was the sound of engineers, supervisors, and department heads desperately clinging to a narrative, one where they still mattered. Where they hadn't already failed. Because when Jalen Carter stepped forward, everything they'd tried to hide beneath sarcasm would come to light. The echoes of laughter hadn't even faded before it happened. The teenager Jalen Carter took one slow step forward. No one told him to move. No one gave him permission. But something about his presence, about the quiet determination in the way he adjusted the strap on his backpack, silenced the room faster than any command from upper management ever had. Behind the glass wall of the control room, a few technicians exchanged glances, waiting for the punchline. Was this a joke? Was the janitor's nephew actually going to walk up to the $6 million automated packaging system, the very machine that had reduced a floor of seasoned engineers to silent shame, and try to fix it? Across the hallway, near the yellow mop bucket, Deshaun Carter, Jalen's uncle and the night janitor, stepped forward. His posture was tense, his voice low but urgent. "Jalen," he called. "You don't have to do this. Come on, boy. Let's go home." Deshaun had seen enough humiliation in this place for a lifetime. He'd mopped the floors when the executives laughed at his ideas. He'd been told to stay in his lane every time he dared to ask a question about the machines he helped maintain. He didn't want that for his nephew. "This place, it wasn't built for us," he whispered, his hand gripping the edge of the cleaning cart. "Don't let them make you the punchline." But Jalen didn't look back. His boots, still streaked with dried red clay from his family's land on the edge of Woodruff County, thudded softly against the concrete as he walked forward. His shoulders were hunched not from fear, but from the quiet gravity of choice. His eyes, dark and steady, locked on the dormant machine like it had called him by name. The engineers inside the control room fell into a hush. Even CEO Graham Whitaker, who had just moments earlier scoffed at the notion of giving the janitors a try, now turned to look. His smirk remained, but there was a flicker of something new in his eyes, something between amusement and curiosity, the way a man watches a mouse wander into a lion's den. "Hey," one of the supervisors muttered under his breath, "is this actually happening?" A low chuckle rippled from the back. "Well, might as well stream this. It'll be the funniest thing we see all week." A few smartphones were already out, held just low enough to avoid getting caught by the cameras in the corners. The thumbnails were forming in real time: "Farm boy fails to fix robot, janitor's kid thinks he's an engineer." #ready humiliation. But Jalen didn't notice. Or maybe he did. And just didn't care. Because as he approached the machine, past the whispering technicians and the blinking red lights, something inside him had shifted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't pride. It was clarity. He remembered the nights out on the farm with his father long before the accident, when broken machinery meant lost harvests, and failure wasn't an option. He remembered greasy hands, bleeding knuckles, and whispered instructions beneath a starry sky. "Every machine's got a rhythm, son," his father used to say. "Listen close enough, and it'll tell you what's wrong." That voice echoed in his head now as the weight of judgment bore down on him from every direction. Inside the control room, the tension grew tighter. Graham Whitaker leaned back against the glass, arms folded, the overhead lights casting sharp shadows across his chiseled face. He still looked in control. Still radiated that boardroom confidence. But beneath that tailored charcoal gray suit, something clenched. This wasn't part of his narrative. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "Let him," he said finally, loud enough for the senior engineers to hear. "We could use a little entertainment." A few heads nodded in agreement, relief disguised as cruelty. Because if Jalen failed as they all expected he would, then the burden wouldn't be on them anymore. The story would shift. The failure would belong to him. Not them. The shame they'd carried for 2 weeks would have a new scapegoat. But Jalen Carter wasn't here to play the villain in someone else's story. He stepped up to the access panel, hands steady, eyes narrowed. The machine loomed before him, towering metal arms, dozens of blinking indicator lights, and rows of modular components worth more than anything his family had ever owned. He didn't flinch. Behind him, his uncle watched in silence, lips pressed into a tight line, afraid of what came next. Inside the control room, Graham tapped his pen twice against the steel table, leaned forward, and whispered under his breath. "Let's see what the boys got." The air inside Creston Dynamics had never felt so quiet. Not when the machine first broke down. Not even when corporate threatened to freeze hiring and suspend bonuses. But now, with a teenager standing in front of a $6 million automation line, it was dead still. The clank of tools, the whir of cooling fans, the beeping status lights, all of it had faded into the background, like the entire factory was holding its breath. Jalen Carter crouched near the control panel, his worn boots scraping softly against the concrete floor. The panel's exterior was scuffed and smudged from weeks of frantic attempts to fix it. Engineers had tried everything: diagnostics, hardware swaps, rewiring. Nothing had worked. The lead engineer, Walter Reed, stepped forward slightly, opening his mouth to protest, but was quickly silenced by a subtle hand gesture from CEO Graham Whitaker. "Let him," Whitaker said, voice tinged with dry amusement. Let's see what the janitor's nephew can do. The comment hung in the air like smoke, bitter and lingering. Jalen ignored it. His fingers hovered over the panel's edge before he flipped open the access cover. Inside, a jungle of wires coiled and crossed, hastily patched during previous repair attempts. Some were frayed. A few had exposed copper ends. Most had been connected in ways that betrayed desperation rather than design. The teenager's brow furrowed. He didn't rush. He just stared. Then, slowly, methodically, he began to trace each wire with his eyes, his fingers occasionally gliding over connections with the intimacy of someone who wasn't just reading diagrams but listening. The engineers nearby watched closely, at first with smirks, then with narrowed eyes. What was he doing? What did he think he could see that the rest of them hadn't? Some of them scoffed quietly. Kids wasting time. Probably doesn't even know which relay handles the primary startup. But Jalen did know. He wasn't just looking at the wires, he was feeling the rhythm of the system. Not metaphorically, but literally. His hand hovered above the relay block, sensing the faint hum of a misaligned circuit, a vibration barely perceptible to those who hadn't grown up fixing hay balers and water pumps by moonlight. To him, this wasn't an expensive monument to collapse. It was just another broken system. And like every other machine he'd helped his father fix back on their farm in eastern Arkansas, it had a voice if you listened. He adjusted his posture, taking a slow breath. The sharp scent of burnt insulation still lingered faintly in the housing. The heat sink was running slightly warmer than it should, and one of the LED indicators was blinking in an irregular rhythm. Too fast, then too slow. It was trying to tell him something. Behind the glass, the murmuring continued. Some of the engineers were losing patience. Others were leaning in now, genuinely curious despite themselves. One of them, Larry Mitchell, a veteran from a Chicago automation firm, shook his head with a smirk. This kid's gonna fry the board. No one responded. Because even as they mocked him, something about Jalen's composure unnerved them. He wasn't panicked, that he wasn't posturing, that he was just working, calm. Silent. Focused, and then, his hand froze. He leaned closer, squinting at a cluster of red and blue wires that had been bundled tightly into a connector block. Something was off. The orientation didn't match the schematic he'd glimpsed earlier. One of the polarity links had been wired backwards. His heart pounded, but he kept his movement steady. With deliberate care, he pulled a multi-tool from his backpack. The tool was nothing fancy, just a well-used screwdriver with a bit set and a few scratches etched into the metal, but in his hands, it looked like precision equipment. As he began to unscrew the terminal clamps, the control room fell utterly silent again. Even Graham Whitaker leaned in. Still smirking, still arms folded, but his eyes were sharper now. Watching. Waiting. He didn't believe this boy would succeed. But for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure he'd fail. Jalen carefully disconnected the inverted wires, adjusted the power leads, and reset the thermal fuse. He brushed away a bit of soot near the main capacitor and took one final breath before gently lowering the access cover back into place. Then he stood. Not with triumph. Not with arrogance. Just stillness. His fingers hovered over the restart button. All around him, the factory was a vacuum of anticipation. Phones were still rolling. Eyes still locked. And somewhere behind the glass, Deshaun Carter whispered a quiet prayer he hadn't said in years. Jalen pressed the button. 1 second. 2 seconds. 5 seconds. Nothing. And then, like the deep rumble of an old tractor catching its first breath after a long winter, the machine stirred. A low hum rolled through the floor. The red status lights blinked once, then faded to green. Gears began to turn. Conveyor belts clicked into motion. The entire line came to life in a smooth, rhythmic cascade. What had been dead for 14 days now pulsed like the beating heart of a living organism. The room exploded. Gasps. Shouts. A few stunned engineers dropped their phones. Others stepped back in disbelief. One even muttered, "No damn way," under his breath. But it had happened. Jalen Carter, the janitor's nephew from a farm outside Jackson County, had just done what no one else could. For a brief moment, everything inside Creston Dynamics stood still even though the machine had begun to move. Jalen Carter remained in place, his hands still resting near the control panel as if unsure whether what he had just done was real. But there was no mistaking it. The massive robotic arms glided smoothly into motion. The conveyor belts rotated with rhythmic precision. Indicator lights danced from red to green in rapid succession. The deadline had come back to life flawlessly. And no one was laughing now. Across the control room, mouths hung open. Engineers who had once exchanged sarcastic glances now looked at one another in stunned silence. It was Walter Reed, the lead systems expert, who finally found his voice. How did he do that? Clara Donnelly, the plant's chief engineer, gritty, analytical, and famously hard to impress, stepped closer to the glass. Her sharp eyes were locked on Jalen, scanning his every movement. Unlike the others, she didn't gasp or stammer. Instead, she whispered to herself, "That wasn't luck." In the background, the mocking voices had gone mute. Even the employees who had snickered just minutes earlier now lowered their phones, no longer eager to record the moment they had hoped would become factory gossip. The laughter had dissolved into reverence. Inside the control room, Graham Whitaker, the CEO in his $1,000 suit and gleaming Swiss watch, stood frozen. For the first time since taking the helm of Creston Dynamics, his confidence flickered. His smirk was gone. His eyes narrowed, locked onto the boy in muddy boots who had just saved his multi-million-dollar machine. And perhaps, his reputation. He clenched his jaw, desperately searching for an explanation that would salvage his authority. This was luck, he muttered under his breath. A fluke. Maybe the system reset itself. Or the earlier fixes finally took hold. But no one responded. Not even his senior managers. Because deep down, they knew the truth. They had all tried. For 2 weeks, top-tier engineers had pored over schematics, cross-checked diagnostics, replaced entire modules and failed. It was Jalen Carter, a 13-year-old with a flannel shirt and a farm boy toolkit, who had walked in and solved what no one else could. From the back of the room, someone began clapping. It wasn't sarcastic that IT wasn't forced, that IT was genuine. Then another person joined in. And another. The applause rolled through the plant like thunder. No one had to be told what they had just witnessed. A miracle, no, a revelation. Jalen stood beside the machine, eyes wide, not from pride but from the sheer magnitude of what had happened. Behind him, his uncle, Deshaun, held a trembling hand to his mouth. The man who had cleaned these floors for 20 years now watched as his nephew rewrote the fate of the entire company. Clara Donnelly pushed open the control room door and walked briskly toward the production line. The engineers parted for her like the Red Sea. When she reached Jalen, she didn't speak right away. She just studied him. Then finally, her voice broke through the hum of machinery. "You did what none of us here could. What did you see that we missed?" Jalen looked up at her, still unsure how to carry this sudden spotlight. "I just listened to the machine," he said quietly. "It wasn't wired right. The signal was reversed. My dad taught me how to look for those kinds of things." Her expression didn't change but her eyes softened. "Your father's an engineer?" Jalen shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. He's a farmer." The silence that followed was deafening. Graham Whitaker, watching from the threshold of the control room, clenched his fists. He had tried to use mockery to draw a line in the sand. A barrier between those who belonged and those who didn't. But that line had just been erased. Worse, it had been erased by someone he had tried to humiliate. One of the younger engineers, still stunned, leaned toward Clara and whispered, "Who is this kid?" But Clara didn't answer. Because in that moment, even she didn't fully know. All she knew was that Jalen Carter had just flipped the script and every power dynamic at Creston Dynamics along with it. The room fell into a strange silence after Jalen's quiet answer. "A farmer?" That single word sent ripples through the ranks of engineers, executives, and floor supervisors alike. For some, it was disbelief. For others, discomfort. Because in that instant, it was no longer just about a miracle fix. It was about the person who had performed it, and where he came from. "Wait," one senior engineer whispered. "Did he say his dad taught him that? A farmer?" Another voice, more doubtful, muttered, "There's no way a kid from some soybean patch knew more than an entire tech division." But Jalen stood calmly, not shrinking from the stares. Then someone asked the inevitable. "What's your father's name?" The question came not from curiosity but challenge. And it came from the highest seat in the room. CEO Graham Whitaker, still standing stiffly near the control room door, had taken a step forward. His tone, icy with the same subtle venom he'd used before, sliced through the air. "Don't tell me some backwoods farmer trained our engineers." He said it louder this time, hoping the old order would echo him. That the room would laugh again, return to form. But no one did. Jalen raised his chin, met Whitaker's gaze without fear, and answered clearly. "My father's name is Calvin Carter." The room froze, the air shifted, some of the older engineers blinked in surprise. "Carter. Calvin Carter," one whispered. "No. It couldn't be." Another replied, voice thick with memory, "You mean the Calvin Carter from the early Henderson robotics project?" Murmurs surged like wildfire. Whispers turned into urgent questions. "That Calvin Carter designed the modular automation core back in '08. He was a legend, vanished after that lab explosion. No one ever saw him again." At the center of the storm, Graham Whitaker's smirk crumbled. His lips twitched. His jaw clenched. But he said nothing. Jalen simply stood still, eyes unwavering. Then right as the tension reached its peak, the door to the production floor opened. A tall black man in worn denim, work boots, and a faded button-down stepped inside. His frame was lean, strong despite his age. His gait was measured. His face bore the weathered lines of years under sun and pressure. And his eyes sharp, steady, swept across the room like a quiet tide. He carried no title. Wore no badge. But everyone knew. It was Calvin Carter. The factory that had once turned its back on him now turned to stone. Even the loudest engineers, the ones who had joked, scoffed, and dismissed Jalen as a janitor's nephew, fell silent in his presence. Calvin walked slowly toward his son. No entourage. No fanfare. Just calm, earned grace. When he reached Jalen, he rested a calloused hand on his shoulder and spoke not to the factory, not to Whitaker, but to his son. "You listened," he said softly. "That's what I always taught you." Jalen nodded once, his eyes glinting with pride. Then Calvin turned to the crowd. "My name is Calvin Carter," he said, his voice quiet but commanding. "I used to work in places like this. Designed some of the systems you're still running today." A hush fell again. Even Clara Donnelly, normally composed and assertive, stood a little straighter. "I left this industry," Calvin continued, "not because I stopped believing in machines. But because too many people stopped believing in me after I got hurt, after I stopped looking like the perfect resume. But that didn't stop me from passing on everything I knew." He turned to face Graham Whitaker directly now. "And today, you all saw what happens when you give anyone a chance to be more than the label you placed on them." Clara was the first to speak. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "Mr. Carter, we remember your work. Your automation designs still define our backbone systems. You are a giant in this field." Calvin smiled faintly. I'm just a farmer now. But I never stopped creating. The words hit like a bolt of lightning in the room. And in that moment, something shifted permanently at Creston Dynamics. The line between power and wisdom blurred. The balance between arrogance and integrity cracked. The same engineers who had ridiculed Jalen now looked at him with genuine awe. Not because of where he came from but because of what he carried. A legacy. A fire. And a name that once reshaped the industry. Graham Whitaker tried to regain control. He took a step forward, forcing a smirk back onto his face. Well, he said with mock warmth, perhaps it was just a stroke of luck. Maybe the previous repairs aligned at the right time. Hard to say exactly who fixed what. No, Clara interrupted sharply. All eyes turned to her. He fixed it. Alone. We all saw it. And we all missed the fault he spotted in seconds. Her tone left no room for denial. Whitaker froze. And as more engineers stepped forward to offer their hands to Jalen, their nods of respect to Calvin, Whitaker realized the worst part of all. He wasn't just losing control of a room. He was losing control of the narrative. Because from this day forward, the Carter name wouldn't be whispered in doubt but spoken with pride. From the moment Calvin Carter stepped onto the floor of Creston Dynamics, something fundamental in the building had changed. It wasn't just the awe. It wasn't even the applause. It was the shift, a silent turning of the tide where every glance, every whispered remark, every power dynamic in the room flipped like a switch. For the first time in years, no one looked at CEO Graham Whitaker for direction. No one waited for his reaction. All eyes were on the Carters. The father who had once been cast aside. And the son who had just shattered every ceiling placed above him. The executives stood quietly, their confident postures now uncertain. The engineers, who just an hour earlier had laughed and pointed at a teenager, now lingered at a respectful distance. And Clara Donnelly, the toughest mind in the building, had taken a visible step beside Jalen as though declaring sides without a word. The balance of power had shifted. And Graham Whitaker knew it. He forced a strained smile and moved toward Calvin, offering his hand in a show of control. Calvin accepted it, but his grip was calm, unyielding. Not aggressive. Just, real. Unlike Graham's. There was a murmur from the crowd, whispers of disbelief, recognition, and sudden accountability. The man who'd been mocked, exiled, and erased had just walked back into the heart of the empire he helped build. And now he stood arm in arm with the boy everyone had tried to diminish. One of the younger engineers, visibly shaken, whispered to a colleague, "We've been listening to the wrong voices this whole time." In that moment, Clara cleared her throat, turned to face the factory floor, and spoke boldly. "There are some values," she said, eyes scanning the stunned faces, "that no title, no suit, no corner office can take away. And I think we've just been reminded what they look like." A soft murmur of agreement rippled outward. Graham tried to reassert himself. "Well," he said, stepping forward, "this is all very moving, but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. The system's fixed. That's good news for us all, and clearly, the previous team's work helped pave the way." The words came out flat. No one cheered. No one laughed. No one followed. Because everyone in that room knew exactly who had fixed the line. It hadn't been the team. It hadn't been the board-certified experts. It had been a teenager in muddy boots. Clara turned her back on Whitaker, an act of quiet defiance, and addressed Jalen directly. "Would you consider joining our engineering program?" Officially, she added. "You don't need a degree yet. What you have, it's real. And we'd be lucky to have you." Gasps rose. Some heads turned. Others looked at the ground in shame. Jalen blinked. He hadn't come here for a job. He hadn't even come here for recognition. He'd come to wait for his uncle, and fix what others couldn't. He looked at Calvin. His father smiled, eyes wet with pride. "It's your choice, son." Jalen nodded, slowly. "I'd be honored." A spontaneous round of applause rose again, this time less like a celebration and more like a reckoning. An acknowledgement. An apology in motion. Across the room, Mark Decker, the manager who had earlier joked about farmers and janitors, stepped forward. His face was pale. His voice wavered. "I was wrong," he said. "I judged you based on what you wore, where you came from. I was wrong." Jalen didn't speak. He simply nodded once, without resentment. The moment wasn't about revenge. It was about resetting the system. Word of what had happened spread across the plant like a shockwave. By the end of the day, the entire Creston Dynamics staff, from engineers to custodians to line workers, knew the story. The factory cafeteria, once filled with hushed insults and quiet hierarchies, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. Employees who never spoke to janitors were now asking Deshaun Carter for advice. Managers stopped to shake Jalen's hand in the halls. Engineers started listening to everyone, regardless of job title. Something in the foundation had cracked open. A few days later, the board of directors met behind closed doors. The tone was different. The old strategies of intimidation and elitism weren't just outdated, they were toxic. Profits had stagnated. Innovation had stalled. Culture had deteriorated. Now, the machine was running, the factory was united. And public interest was spiking. By unanimous vote, the board made the decision that had once been unthinkable. Graham Whitaker would be removed as CEO. The announcement came 2 weeks after the incident. It was brief. Clean. Brutal. Graham, ever the politician, tried to mask the sting with his usual confidence. But as he exited the plant for the final time, escorted not by assistance but silence, he realized something far worse than being fired had happened. He had become irrelevant. Because the company no longer needed fear. It had found something stronger. Something real. The fall of Graham Whitaker didn't come with a scandal. There were no angry protests, no leaked documents, no lawsuits. Just silence. And that silence was louder than any storm. Because in the halls of Creston Dynamics, the new power didn't march in shouting. It walked in muddy boots, with calloused hands, calm voices, and a depth of understanding the old guard never bothered to learn. Whitaker's corner office was cleared in less than a day. The nameplate was gone. His parking spot reassigned. The aura of fear he once cloaked himself in had evaporated, replaced by the quiet awe surrounding the Carters. Calvin Carter, now officially appointed senior technical advisor, didn't ask for an office. He preferred walking the floor, stopping to assist junior engineers, inspecting faulty gearboxes with a soft whistle and a sharp eye. When asked how he saw things others missed, Calvin always replied the same way. "I've seen broken things my whole life. I just stopped being afraid of fixing them." Meanwhile, Jalen Carter became something entirely new to the plant, an idea. A symbol. A living embodiment of what happens when prejudice fails and truth gets a chance to breathe. He wasn't given some honorary badge or hollow title. Instead, he was offered something better. Leadership of the Innovation Unit, a post Whitaker once swore was reserved only for Ivy League candidates with double degrees and executive references. Now, a 13-year-old with no diploma was heading the very team that used to mock him. And the results? Undeniable. Within the first month, Jalen's design revisions improved packaging throughput by 17%, saving the company over $400,000 in wasted labor and diagnostics. His reprogrammed sensor logic eliminated a glitch that had plagued the line for 2 years, something top consultants had failed to resolve. Even the most hardened skeptics began requesting time with him one-on-one. The same people who had recorded his humiliation now took notes during his briefings. But this wasn't just about machines. The culture of Creston Dynamics, the very soul of the plant, was changing. In one meeting, Mark Decker, the same mid-level manager who had once laughed the loudest, stood before the room, cleared his throat, and said, "I want to apologize. Publicly. I judged a kid for his skin, his boots, his background. I didn't see his value. And I don't ever want to make that mistake again." There was no applause. Just understanding. A few days later, Mark volunteered to head a new outreach program, bringing STEM education to rural schools and offering internships to underprivileged teens. Not as penance, but as purpose. All of it inspired by Jalen. Clara Donnelly, Creston's chief engineer, became Jalen's fiercest advocate. In every board meeting, she championed his ideas, defended his proposals, and when one veteran engineer questioned Jalen's youth, she shot back. "If anyone here can fix a $6 million system in 30 minutes without formal training, by all means, take my position." No one did. Even Whitaker's loyalists, those who had thrived under his cold structure, began to change. They stopped whispering in corners. Stopped scoffing at anyone without a title. Instead, they started listening. And in those moments of humility, something extraordinary began to grow. Community. Compassion. Trust. Creston Dynamics didn't just become profitable again. It became meaningful. The break rooms, once silent and segregated, now buzzed with laughter. Teams no longer formed based on alma maters, but on collaboration. Ideas were judged not by who said them, but by their merit. For the first time in company history, mechanics, technicians, custodial workers, and engineers shared equal footing in open forums. Jalen led weekly innovation huddles, his presence pulling in talent across departments. People came not just to solve problems but to be part of something greater. Even Calvin Carter, once written off as a relic, became the quiet force behind every major design decision. He mentored new hires, taught them how to read vibrations through metal, how to diagnose systems by listening rather than assuming. Machines, he told them, are like people. They break differently. You have to respect that. Soon, industry leaders began to notice. Publications ran features like, "The Teen Who Rewired Corporate Engineering." From Farm to Factory, The Carter Legacy. Creston's New Core, Talent Over Titles. Universities requested Jalen to speak. He declined most, preferring to focus on building, not basking. But when he did speak, his message was clear: "I'm not here to prove that black kids from farms are smart. I'm here to remind everyone that talent has no address, no dress code, and no approval needed. You just need the courage to keep showing up." And show up he did. Every day. Still in worn flannel. Still in those same dusty boots. He never asked for a new office. He never stopped visiting his uncle during cleaning rounds. Because for Jalen, this victory wasn't about erasing the past, it was about rewriting the future. Months passed. But the memory of that day, the day a boy in muddy boots brought a factory back to life, never faded at Creston Dynamics. Instead, it became legend. The poster of Jalen Carter, standing in front of the revived automation line, flannel sleeves rolled up and grease on his hands, was framed in the main hallway. Below it, the quote read, "Talent doesn't come with a name badge. It comes with courage." But Jalen never let the moment define him. He understood something most adults took decades to grasp, that real change isn't a spotlight. It's what you do after the lights go down. So he kept showing up. Every morning. Same boots. Same flannel. Same quiet focus. While executives held board meetings, Jalen met with floor technicians and young interns. He started after-hours workshops for kids from low-income neighborhoods, bringing them into the plant to teach them what he'd learned, not just about circuits and systems, but about confidence. At his side, always, was Calvin Carter, the man once discarded, now reborn as a mentor not only to his son, but to the entire industry. Together, they weren't just repairing machines. They were repairing belief. Belief in second chances. In overlooked talent. In the power of humility, perseverance, and hands that know how to build from the ground up. The ripples extended far beyond Arkansas. Local news turned into regional features. Then came national attention: Time, Forbes, Wired. All telling the story of a boy from a dusty field who had redefined what it meant to lead. #BeLikeJalen trended on social media. Kids in Chicago, Atlanta, Detroit, and rural Kansas began posting photos of their own workshop projects. Teachers used his story in lesson plans. Colleges invited him to speak, but he turned most down. "I don't need to be a keynote," he once said. "I need to be available." The Department of Education reached out. They wanted Jalen and Calvin to help craft a new national STEM initiative focused on underserved youth. Meanwhile, Creston Dynamics experienced something no boardroom could manufacture: transformation from the inside out. Prejudice, once baked into policies and backroom jokes, was confronted head-on. New hiring protocols were launched. Recruitment teams visited high schools that had never once been on the company's radar. Internal culture shifted. Diversity was no longer decoration, it was direction. And at the center of it all, Jalen Carter. Still listening. Still learning. Still lifting others. One day, during a company-wide town hall, a nervous young woman from HR stood up and asked Jalen, "What's your end goal here?" Jalen smiled softly, his voice steady. "To make sure no kid ever walks into a room and gets laughed at just for existing." Silence, then applause, not just clapping but belief. Behind him, Calvin Carter stood proudly, watching a new kind of legacy take root. One built not on profit margins or quarterly forecasts, but on courage, community, and quiet, relentless hope. A few months later, in a dusty school gym outside Stuttgart, Arkansas, Jalen stood in front of a group of high schoolers, many wearing the same worn boots and shy expressions he once had. He held up a piece of old wiring from the factory's failed machine. "This," he said, "isn't just copper and plastic. It's a reminder." The room leaned in. He smiled. "People will tell you that where you're from decides where you're going. That how you speak, dress, or look defines your limit. But they're wrong. You're not wiring. Your power. Your potential. And no one gets to wire you wrong unless you let them." A pause. Then he raised the wire over his head and snapped it in half. The crowd erupted. Back at Creston Dynamics, things moved forward faster than ever. Projects once deemed impossible now passed across Jalen's desk with hopeful eyes. Engineers brought him problems not because he was a miracle, but because he listened. To them. To the machines. To the future. Clara Donnelly, now promoted to Chief Innovation Officer, credited the entire cultural rebirth to one thing: we stopped managing. We started trusting. As for Graham Whitaker, the former CEO who once ruled with sarcasm and suspicion, he watched it all from afar. His name forgotten. His influence gone. A cautionary tale in every boardroom. Because no amount of control, no chain of command, could withstand the power of authenticity. Years from now, when books are written about corporate transformation, equity in engineering, or the moment diversity stopped being a buzzword and became a force, Jalen Carter's name will be in bold. But if you ask him, he'll still just say, "I was raised by a farmer. I learned to listen. And I never stopped believing I belonged." And that, more than any algorithm or executive memo, changed everything. Jalen Carter didn't walk into that factory to prove anything. He walked in because something was broken and he knew he could fix it. But in doing so, he didn't just repair a machine. He exposed a system built on assumptions, on polished resumes, on who looks the part, instead of who can do the work. The lesson? Talent doesn't need permission. Genius doesn't need a title. And value doesn't come in a suit and tie. It lives in curiosity. In persistence. In people we often overlook. For every Jalen out there, there are thousands more kids, workers, dreamers whose ideas, potential, and dignity are ignored because they don't fit the mold. That ends with us. Here's what you can do right now: start seeing people for what they bring, not what they wear. Speak up when you see bias. Silence feeds injustice. Share this story in schools, in meetings, in boardrooms. Mentor someone who's never been invited to the table. Because the next world-changing idea might be standing quietly in muddy boots waiting for a chance. Be the one who opens the door. Like. Comment. Share. Not for the algorithm, but for the world we deserve to build together.